So the purpose of this video is to not only look at what happened as a result of the Great War and, World War One, but often, when we've learned about World War One in the past, the emphasis is on the American experience, which is clearly understandable. However, we do want to look at what else was happening. All right, so as opposed to just focusing on the Western Front, we want to look at others, like, for example, the Eastern Front. Now, the Eastern Front is mainly the Germans versus the Russians. The initial plan for Germany was to very quickly defeat the Russians, so then they could refocus and concentrate all of their resources on fighting in the Western Front. But this didn't work out as easily. So for a good portion of the war, there's the Western and Eastern Fronts, where Germany is somewhat overextending their resources. Now, Russia had begun to industrialize in the late 19th century, but they're mostly still agrarian, nation of farmers. And this hurts them against industrial superpowers. This greatly hurts them. The war itself was real unpopular in Russia, so morale amongst the troops started out very low, and it simply got worse from there. Now, the soldiers and sailors who fought for Russia are mostly serfs, and they feel no loyalty towards their mostly aristocratic officers. So there's frequent mutinies, and there are times where the Russian soldiers kill their commander rather than follow their instructions in battle. Now, some of them simply removed their uniforms, set their weapons down, and just left. They walked home. Now, the war disrupts food production, so while it's happening, famine grips the nation. Factories are going to begin to close once they lose access to the Western capital that financed the industrialization process. Now, despite all of this, Tsar Nicholas II refuses to even consider surrender. So there's an Eastern Front and a Southern Front, which obviously a little bit covered. Sorry about that, but Southern Front gives you a good view of the soldiers there. Here's where the Ottomans come into play. Now, the Ottoman Empire secretly sides with Germany in an effort to get more land from Russia. So this means that the new Southern Front extends the war into the Middle East and North Africa. German banks and manufacturers had already invested heavily into the Ottoman economy in the late 19th century, so they simply viewed an alliance with Germany as protection from the British, French, and the Russians. Side with these Europeans, then we'll be protected from other Europeans. Now, the Southern Front highlights the use of soldiers from throughout the established empires. So, for example, we're not necessarily going to be seeing troops from Great Britain sent to the Southern Front. It'll be what you can see as the Anzac troops, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. There's one prime example where they were used to attack a fortified Ottoman position at Gallipoli. And after 250,000 casualties, the British withdrew. England understood that they couldn't necessarily divert resources from home, so that's why they mobilized men from their African and Asian colonies. Now, black soldiers from Jamaica were deployed against the Ottomans in Palestine, while the Egyptians under British command were the main force there. England will also ally with Arab leaders because they know they're unhappy with Ottoman rule. So they actually are instrumental in helping to organize Arab revolts. If you're familiar with Lawrence of Arabia, think along those lines. England is also going to use their Indian forces to fight in East Africa against African German forces. So it's not just the British that get involved. The Germans will use people from their colonies. Now, with the French example, Vietnamese men are going to do tedious work, like maintaining roads, digging fortifications. North Africans from Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria are conscripted by the French. Chinese workers are recruited to fight in the Western Front. So Indians, West Africans, and Vietnamese, who are conscripted by the British and the French, they toil. They produce raw materials for the war effort. They get little in return. The claims these people made to greater self-government are based on this principle, and the sacrifices they made. So when you see that it led to future independence movements, looking at Cold War and decolonization, much of it begins here. Now, Germany did seem like they might be poised to end the stalemate between the two sides. They did force an embarrassing exit of Russia and were able to shift their resources to the Western Front, which, that was their plan all along. They just thought they could do it a little sooner. Just when this occurred, the United States entered the war due to a number of factors. And from any U.S. history course you've taken, you probably have heard of the Zimmermann Note, Germany contacting Mexico in secret, the resuming of unrestricted submarine warfare. This coalition of factors leads to U.S. entry. The idea here is that we, the U.S., are going to make the world safe for democracy. That's the slogan that we push out there. Now it's a possibility since Russia is out of the war. The absolute monarchy has left. The influx of over 1 million Americans does help turn the tide. And the armistice is signed on November 11th, 1918, which is now celebrated as Veterans Day. Now, of the 10 million casualties, most of them are male. So we have a generation without fathers. Double that amount. So, 20 million are wounded, crippled, disfigured. The death that this leads to amongst the elite and well-educated, combined with the absolute destruction of France, is going to lead many to question the concept of civilization. Now, the horrors of the war are going to lead many to also question Europe itself. These European values and the legacy of the Enlightenment, and their values of progress, tolerance, rationality. Are they good if this is the end result? Some are going to flat out reject the West. And they're going to wonder whether it was actually superior and if science and technology are unquestionably good things. Because if science and technology is going to lead to machine guns and poisonous gas and tanks that can be used for destruction, is it really positive? Now, a lot of these feelings are summed up in the classic novel All Quiet on the Western Front, which will subsequently be banned in Nazi Germany. This is an issue that still has a lot of relevancy in the present day. Integrating millions of veterans back into civilian life is not an easy task, and to their credit, governments did their best to accommodate them. In Great Britain, there were homes for heroes that were set up to make this transition easier. And with massive casualties, 10 million casualties, there's a path that opens up for the previously disadvantaged to move into superior social positions. This is similar to what we saw after the Black Death in Europe. Now, there were conservative forces who tried to undo the cultural changes of the war. The war is over. England says to their women, hey, it's time to leave your factory jobs. The men have returned. In France, conservatives are going to push this thing called Mother's Day as a new holiday to encourage women to procreate, have children, replace the men lost in the war. However, there were major changes, as we've seen, in the lives of women that couldn't be undone. Many nations are going to endorse and grant women the right to vote, like Britain, America, Germany, the Soviet Union, Hungary, Poland. And there will be new work opportunities. The post-war era, we call it Jazz Age. And liberated women are going to dress like flappers. They're going to drink and dance in nightclubs. This is a clear contrast to the earlier social norms. Consumerism is going to encourage people to buy goods, get things like these new washing machines, or vacuum cleaners, irons, things that are meant to symbolize progress. We have radios and movies that'll be the new medium for popular culture. American jazz goes to Europe. Hollywood stars are going to be the new international celebrities. Now, politically, we can see the contrast between 1914 and then a couple of years after the war. Europe is redrawn. Austro-Hungarian Empire, gone. Totally broken up into new nation states. Now, unfortunately, there are ethnic minorities within their boundaries that are still unstable. Classic example is when you look at Yugoslavia. It's going to be broken up decades later because the issue hasn't been resolved. Now, you want to talk legacies? Germany was punished. They were blamed 100% for this war. When the established nations, so to speak, met to sign the Treaty of Versailles, Germany lost 15% of its territory and all of its colonies. They're blamed for the war. They have to pay reparations. The military is restricted. It was all their fault. They had to accept sole responsibility. There was one soldier who served for Germany that said, "It cannot be that 2 million Germans should have fallen in vain. No, we do not pardon. We demand vengeance." Spoken by a soldier named Adolf Hitler. Germany receiving the blame will only foster greater resentment, and it directly leads to the rise of Nazis. Now, the Young Turk nationalist movement has long been, at this point, they've been suspicious of Armenians. They feared that the Armenians might work with the Russians, so they launched a campaign of deportation and murder against 1 million. 1 million Armenians. Now, keep in mind, genocide had not been used as a word yet, but some historians feel that these actions set the precedent with how the Nazis were going to handle those they called undesirable. Now, the war saw uprisings from various Arab groups, as we've seen, with British backing, and this causes the Ottoman Empire to ultimately collapse. Now, the new Turkish Republic, with the Young Turk leaders, are going to emerge from the ruins. New states called Syria, Iraq, Palestine are going to emerge. But there were conflicting promises, as we'll see later on, that the Brits made to Jews and Arabs. And there'll be further conflict over the Holy Land. Many Arabs went from being controlled by the Ottoman Empire to being governed by the British or the French as mandates of the new League of Nations. So these are more issues that need to be resolved. Many in the colonies are simply stunned by the massive slaughter they saw in Europe. They went home with less respect for their rulers. They had military skills, but they had expectations of better treatment because of their service. Now, in order to get support for the war, the French and the British did make promises for reforms and paths towards independence. Britain publicly announced that India was going to be put on the road to self-government. This is after World War I. But this, along with other promises, simply not kept. The Japanese will use this war to move into German territory in China. And the Japanese will place a series of demands on China. See, all the focus is on Europe. Nobody's paying attention to the fact that the Japanese have built up, they've industrialized. They're going to become a force to be reckoned with. Now, the unwillingness of these allied powers to check Japan turned many Chinese nationalists towards the Soviet Union, because the Soviets were the only power that spoke out against imperialism, and they seemed to be willing to put an end to imperialist penetration in China. Now, Europe is devastated. The United States has expanded in terms of industry. We're now a powerful player on the world stage. Our soldiers directly contributed to the end of the war, and the United States will be the creditor of Europe because we have sound finances and we're not wrecked physically. Wilson's optimistic efforts to create a new and just world order will raise our diplomatic profile, and he was a rock star. When he showed up in Paris in 1919, absolute rock star, he was adored. Now, of his 14 points, only the League of Nations made it through. They were going to be a peacekeeping body for the purpose of collective security. Senate refused to join because then the U.S. would have to seemingly bow to the will of other nations. Now, Wilson had hoped that the world could be governed by moral principles rather than secret deals and imperialism, but the sheer fact that Wilson's nation was unable to join the governing body that he wanted to create, that's going to severely limit the power of the League of Nations.